Let's get started. On Friday, we started chapter, whatever this is, 15, I think, thank you. Chapter 15. We're looking at the start of many of today's modern states. Okay, and we started off looking at the three main Muslim kingdoms at this time. All right, we looked at the Ottomans and some of the things that they were doing. In this case, if you recall from Friday, they were one of the few that were open to other cultures and other influences. They had a varied educational system that allowed people to pick what type of education they would have depending on, their career plans. And of course, because part of their empire extended into Europe, they did very quickly adopt the various scientific discoveries from Europe, and also, even though it was, about 200 years later, they did adopt much of the art from the Renaissance period and incorporated it into Ottoman art. We looked at Safavid Persia. While they were a little bit more closed off, they did develop on their own various works of art, and we see this in the the various tapestries, rugs, mosaics, calligraphy. All of this, came about during this time. They were one of the first to include illustrations in their books, which before this time was just strictly words. And of course, one of the things about the Safavids is that, and I went through it briefly, remember that Islam, like other religious groups, has undergone several splits, several divisions, and so there are various groups. One of the first splits was between a group known as Sunni and a group known as Shia, and where most of the Muslim countries were in fact Sunni, the Safavids were strict adherents to the Shia or Shiite form of Islam. Finally, we looked at the Mughal Empire. Remember that this is India, and so basically the Mughals were Muslims that were ruling over a large Indian population. And so because of this, we do see this mixing of various cultures, various ideas. The Mughals begin to adopt some of the ideas that come from both Buddhism and Hinduism, and vice versa. The predominant Hindu population begins to adopt a little bit of the Muslim ideas, and so in India we see then a kind of a struggle between conservatives and liberals in both Islam and Hinduism. Both Muslim population and Hindu population begin to split along, these different ideologies. Now, today we will look at Asia and East Asia, and hopefully also get into some of the changes in Europe during this time. Now, we're going to start off with China. And remember that this period covers from around the 1500s until the 1700s. And so by this point in time, because remember that the Chinese were the ones that invented the printing press, but their original invention relied on wooden typeset, whereas you had to carve it out, and so you could basically only print like one sheet of whatever. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and Johann Gutenberg makes improvements to it by making the type out of metal and being able to remove it. Okay, so you can, adapt it, switch it around to what you need. And so by this point in time, then this development has made it back to China. Okay, and so because of this, all right, the Chinese are now able to also publish all kinds of works, all kinds of essays, all kinds of books. And so in this case, we see then a writing down or a dissemination of various ideas because of the printing press. And when the Europeans arrived and came to China, they were amazed at how much printed works the Chinese had, because even though the Reformation had made it, more accessible, what was the only thing that was really, really printed a lot of? The Bible, yeah. And the Chinese, on the other hand, were printing everything, not just certain things, but pretty much anything you can think of. And so, it's like, damn, what? These are a lot of Bible. No, it's not just religious texts. They're working on everything else. Okay. Now, of course, the only drawback is that in Chinese society, most of this was catered to the elites. Okay, and like in most cultures, and I don't want to say it was strictly like an Asian thing or a Chinese thing, but even up until 100 years ago, people that couldn't read or write, it was something fairly common. Okay, so obviously, typically it was only the elites that had the education to be able to read and write and participate in all this. Okay, one of the biggest thing though, that we see during this time, if you recall, it was the Chinese that came up with the concept of a civil service exam, that if you wanted to work for the government, there was a test that you had to take to prove that you were smart enough and capable enough to do it. Well, this has been going on for a couple hundred years. Now, with the advent of the printing press, and let me step back, with the Gutenberg press, with the movable type, why don't we just have study guides? Why don't we prepare people for these exams? Someone that wants to be, a part of the government should be able to. Okay, and so a lot of the books, all right, that were found in Chinese libraries, were these study guides for these tests that you had to take. Eventually, though, as always, there's always critics. One of the biggest criticism in China during this time is that you should learn because you love learning. All right? You shouldn't just, remember things for an exam. All right? And it's a debate that, literally we still have. Type of thing. All right? Another thing that we see during this time, which unfortunately is pretty quickly shut down, because now there is access to be able to print all of these things, we begin to see women, Chinese women, begin to publish various works. Of course, and once again, I am so sorry, ladies, throughout most of history, women have been kept silent. Even in Europe, if women wanted to publish, typically they had to use a fake name or assume a male identity, to be able to have their works published. And so China very, very quickly put an end to, many of these works that were put out by women. All right. Your textbook then goes into some of the cultural habits, some of the other ways in which Chinese women were kind of, kept away from some of this stuff. The tradition where women marry into their husband's family hasn't gone away. So you marry a man, that's it. Your family's gone. Because you're going to be taking care of his family, for the rest of your life. All right. And of course, now we have censorship of women who started to publish various works. One of the other things that your textbook mentions is the idea of foot binding. I literally just took this from Google. All right. And if there's any feet people in here, all right, calm down. One of the things that was considered attractive in Chinese women during this time was small, delicate feet. Okay? You could have, long brown hair, okay, whatever. Sorry, there's no blonde. Oh, Alicia, blonde hair, whatever, blue eyes, green eyes. But the thing that superseded all of that, tiny feet, okay, little feet, little bitty feet, okay. So obviously, as a parent, okay, you want your daughter to have, hey, I want her to get married off and, whatever. So people would start binding the feet of women when they were small, so that as they got older, their feet were teeny tiny little things. Okay. It got to the point where like some women couldn't even walk. Because obviously, like, Kiara's like, ugh. All right. I don't know how you ladies do it with heels, much less something like this, okay, where your feet, have been deformed in this way, all because of a beauty standard, okay? Now, just as an FYI, different cultures have different things that they do for stuff like that. One of the things that I've studied is like ancient Maya culture. And for whatever reason, the Mayas thought that a flat forehead was attractive. So babies would have a board put on their head almost immediately after they were born so that their heads would be like that. Okay, and so that I don't get. I'm like, oh, I'm glad leave my forehead alone. Type of thing. So, but anyways, this was one of the ways in which women were kind of controlled in ancient China. All right, now. Once again, okay, despite the abundance of printed works, despite these huge libraries, and I already mentioned it, most average people could not read or write, okay? And it isn't just in China, all right, in most places, all right? Your average person could not read or write because only the wealthy, only the elite could afford an education. Okay, and so in many places, we begin to see an oral tradition spring up, but not just that, but because, oral traditions can be messed up and they can be, I don't know, I see some of you falling asleep now. They can be a little boring. Maya's laughing, I'm awake, just listening to someone talk. And so the Chinese began to develop these different ceremonies and these performances and dances and whatnot to illustrate then these stories and these tales and this history. And so we begin to see, different forms of theater with music and, all, the paintings and the fan, to try to, transmit to the people the things that they couldn't read themselves, okay? We also see, okay, the rise and the spread of various religious groups, okay? One of the biggest influences that enters China around this time is Buddhism, and today, Buddhism is actually bigger in China than it is in India, even though India is where it started, okay? And honestly, I wasn't all that versed in Buddhism. And so I know, like, both in my History 1 and in this class, I've shown, like, a couple things having to do with Buddhism. In History 1, we talk a little bit about some of the changes that come to Buddhism over time. One of the things that the Chinese did, because I actually asked a student once, why is Buddha like fat and chubby and like smiling and all of that's actually a Chinese, that's what happened to Buddha after he came in contact with Chinese culture, okay? Before that, Buddhism depicted, Buddha as skinny with a little thing on top. It was more Greek influenced, okay? After Buddhism comes in contact with Chinese culture, he gets fat and smiley. All right, not sure what went on there. We see a rise in Taoism, bless you, okay? Remember the philosophy of Taoism. If I could draw, I would draw the yin and yang symbol, okay? Where basically, we're looking for harmony in the universe. Everything has its opposite, okay? When there's light, the opposite is dark. Hot has it cold. Fire has water, okay? And that basically, it isn't necessarily good or bad. It's just that everything has its opposite, and things that happen around us is the universe trying to balance itself out, because when the universe is out of balance, that's when we get, crazy shit happening. And that, of course, it's not just a thing in the world, but it should also be something of you, okay? You need to find that balance within yourself, okay, in order to be able to, live a good life. So we see that philosophy coming forth, all right? In addition, and I know I've talked about this in History 1, but going back to the idea of the mandate of heaven, remember, and I've talked about it in this class, remember that the Chinese believed that a family was chosen to rule. And once they lost that favor, they would be overthrown and replaced by a different family. Okay? Up until this point, they believed that there was a supreme being out there, okay, who chose the family. It is during this time that the idea begins to shift from a supreme being to the universe. Okay, there's some force in the universe that does this. There is no God. Okay, and so because of that, okay, and I should have put these together. Okay, the emperor or the king or whomever, okay, needed to be in touch with that, needed to be, sensitive to the changes of the universe and what the universe was trying to tell us, and be an agent for, okay, there's unbalance. I need to be the one who's out there working to bring balance to the universe. Okay, now, because of this, okay, and let me take a step back. Some of the inventions of the Chinese, if you recall, the compass, gunpowder, the printing press. Obviously, I already talked about the printing press. During this time, each of these things undergoes like improvements and betterments, okay, and refinements, so that, it goes boom, but really big boom now, okay? And of course, the compass becomes more accurate and whatnot. And so using all of this and using the knowledge and taking his responsibility seriously, okay, basically the king, the emperor, was able to commission people and have people work for him. And so, yes, the Chinese were in fact able to calculate eclipses and comets and different astronomical phenomena, okay? Before, we see that many Europeans are doing this as well, okay? And so because of this, all right, when the Europeans arrived in China and tried to, show off with their, knowledge and devices and whatnot, especially with their knowledge of the stars and other phenomena, the Chinese were like, yeah, we already know that. Like, you're not telling us any shit we didn't know already, okay? Gunpowder, your ancestors got it from us, all right? The compass, yeah, we did that. And granted, we'll acknowledge that you guys made it better, but we invented the printing. So when the Europeans then tried to show off certain things, they're like, yeah, no, we've already done that. You can calculate any, guess what? So can we. All right, we know what is happening. And so it was because of this that when the Europeans did share knowledge that the Chinese did not have, they're like, no, you tried to trick us once before. No, you're not going to get away with that. And so one of the things was that when Europeans arrived and they tried to show the Chinese these formulas on how to calculate that the world was round and stellar observations, they're like, no, we don't believe you, okay? You tried to impress us with your knowledge before, and you're not going to do it this time, okay? The other thing about the Chinese during this time is that if it was going on outside of China, they didn't care, all right? It didn't affect them, so, why? All right, unlike the Europeans who were, out there exploring and looking for things. And one of the things that the Chinese, of course, failed to recognize, which, it happens to every group, I suppose, is that to them, the Europeans were all the same. They didn't quite understand that they were actually speaking different languages and that they were like from different cultures and they had slightly different beliefs. To them, no offense, my Euro-American friends, it was just a bunch of strange white people coming over trying to get stuff, all right? And it didn't matter what country they were from, okay? Looking at Japan now, during this same time, okay? Up until the 1600s, okay? It was typically only the elite Japanese that had access to different things like art and culture and music and dance, okay? It wasn't something that was open to the public. It was a privilege of the elite, of the wealthy, okay? And so in this case, generally the emperor and his family, all of the shoguns, because remember, military ruler of Japan, they were the ones that were actually making the decisions, and of course, certain, families that were part of the ruling class, okay? And so because of this, other groups in Japan had to come up with their own forms of entertainment and their own forms of theater and music and whatnot, okay? Now, even though they were the warriors and even though they were like the local warlords, they weren't part of that upper ruling class. And so the samurai and the daimyo, okay, participated in a type of theater called no, all right? And if we have time, I will show you a brief example, okay? Basically, everybody wore a mask, okay? And different things were performed. Some people think it's kind of weird, but it was also happening in Europe and in other parts of the world. All of the parts were played by men, okay? Now, amongst the regular people, amongst the working class, so the upper class, the shogun, the emperor, they have their theater, they have their entertainment. The samurai and the daimyo have their theater and entertainment, and then the working class, the average peoples, okay? Number one, okay, we begin to see a proliferation of written works also. Chinese, printing presses have made it over to Japan with the German modifications. And so we begin to see then the publishing of books, okay? Number two, geishas, all right? These were women, all right? For lack of a better term, kind of prostitutes. All right, they did perform like erotic dance and on occasion also engaged in certain sexual relations, okay? The most popular and probably the one that a lot of people think of when they think of like Japanese theater is kabuki, okay? Kabuki had different types of music that went along with it, and it's the one with like the painted faces, okay, and stuff like that, and different costumes, whereas no, they wore masks, okay, so there was some difference to it, okay. When it came to the themes and the topics, they ranged from pretty much anything, but, and it's kind of interesting because amongst the upper class, okay, stories of the average people fascinated them because it was a world that they did not experience, okay? For them, it was a dangerous world, okay? Because they lived a very, very sheltered life. All right. I like to tell people, yeah, it's like, why do people sit and watch documentaries about, psycho killers and, oh my gosh, Criminal Minds. I think I watched like 3 seasons once in a week. Because it's a dangerous world, killers and psychos. It's like, ooh, I know who did it, and then you're wrong, but you're like, no, that's the unsub. The whole thing. And so to the upper class, this was also, it's like, oh my gosh, he's going to work. What would it be like to like go to a job? All right, type of thing. All right, now, okay, because of, all right, the influx of books and the influence of the printing press out of China, we see people learning how to read. Okay, we see people learning at rates that they hadn't seen before. But once again, I am so sorry, ladies. It was only for the men. Only the men had access to these books and to this literature. Okay. Pretty soon there is a huge supply, but not enough to meet the demand for all of them. Also, it didn't matter what level of society you were in. If you were a man, whether you were upper class, middle, lower, if you were a samurai, you had access to books. Unfortunately, if you're part of the working class, you really can't afford to buy them. So, the idea of a library originates in Japan, where certain collections of books are kept. And you could come, borrow a book, and then return it when you're done reading it. Okay? This is something that, would happen like maybe if it's about 150 years later in other parts of the world. One of the first libraries here in what eventually becomes the United States is in Philadelphia, from Benjamin Franklin. The idea that you can't afford books, because they were still expensive. You can't afford books, then why should this deny you access? You can just borrow it, do what you need to do, and then give it back. Okay, well, it was the Japanese that first came up with that idea. All right. As far as religion goes, this is another area where Japan is influenced by China. Okay. They do adopt, and don't get me wrong, it's not identical, but Japanese writing uses many Chinese characters. Okay, in the same way, not the same way, not 100% the same, but the way, I also teach Spanish, all right? Spanish letters are basically English letters. We just rearrange them differently, and they sound differently in some cases, okay? Kind of the same thing, all right? They used the writing style if it wasn't like identical, and obviously the different symbols didn't mean the same things, okay? And this, in part, comes because not only did those printing presses come from China, but Buddhist monks came to Japan to obviously spread Buddhism, but along the way, because all they had was like Chinese material, then yes, the Japanese adopted a lot of these things from China, and then, made it their own. Okay? Now, in addition to Buddhism, which even though Buddhism is fairly popular in Japan, there are some Japanese religions, okay? Probably the largest one, and most people that I've met are some level of Shinto. This is something that is strictly Japanese, okay? Buddhism comes from China. All right. And then, of course, we already talked about how a lot of Japanese were converted to Christianity and et cetera. Okay. In this case, Shinto is strictly based, number one, on I don't want to say ancestor worship, but reverence for your ancestors and acknowledging their part in influencing your life. Okay, number one. Number two, they believe that there are different gods in different parts of nature. which is why, okay, you will have shrines in areas that, like, this is one of our gods right there, that pine tree. It has survived this rather weird winter. And so let's build a temple right here, okay, to this pine tree. This is the survivor god type of thing. And so everything, it can be a holy place, okay? When it comes to European influence, okay, remember from the last chapter, the only Europeans that were allowed to have any kind of presence in Japan were the Dutch, okay? Why were they the only ones allowed? All they wanted was trade, okay? They weren't trying to convert anyone, and in this case, you have to remember, originally, yes, the Japanese did allow Christian missionaries, but of course, no offense, Christians, they were pretty rude and nasty, not just to the Japanese, but to each other, and, one Christian faith would be fighting another Christian faith over, which Jesus was better. And so eventually the Japanese do kick them all out. The Dutch were the only ones that were like, we don't care, you're all going to hell anyway, so we're not going to preach anything to you. We just want to buy and sell things. And so they were the only ones that were allowed in Japan. And so in Japanese, the term translates to Dutch learning when it comes to learning about stuff that is outside of Japanese culture. Okay, even though you could be learning about whatever, all right, it's still referred to as Dutch learning. Now, as these different Dutch ideas begin to spread throughout Japan, okay, little by little, the Japanese begin to get more and more curious, okay, about, these other, because, the Dutch do mention, hey, there are other, people. Remember, once upon a time, they were here with you before the Shogun kicked them out. And so as people get more curious about these things, they pressure the government so that in 1720, the Shogun begins to allow foreign books in Japan. Up until this point, okay, it was just, word of mouth from the Dutch. Okay, but now the Dutch are allowed to bring in these books, and they're not just Dutch books, although most of them are, okay, but they are from other cultures. So that eventually, okay, between 1720 and 1745, all right, in 1745, we see the first Dutch-Japanese dictionary, okay, because we get such an influx of these books into the country that people are like, okay, I don't know what this is saying. You're going to have to, help me out with this. But in the meantime, all right, different texts, different books that have to do with all kinds of different things are translated into Japanese so that the people now don't have to try to read it in Dutch, even though that's the only language you're allowed to learn. And so in this way, these books are now accessible to pretty much anyone who wants them, not just the Japanese who can speak Dutch, okay? So we see then European influence beginning to expand, okay? I'm going to stop right there, and we will look at Europe. Come on. All right. We will look at Europe on Wednesday, but just before we go, if I can get this to work, I just want to show you an example of kabuki. I think that should work. This is kabuki. As I mentioned, okay, this is the one with the painted faces, okay, the elaborate dresses, the motions and whatnot, okay. And yes, it was accompanied by music,